She didn't crash into my club to hide. She came here to die, bleeding, shaking, looking over her shoulder like something worse than death was behind her. And then, he walked in. Charcoal suit. Calm smile. The kind of man who doesn't chase you. Because he already owns you. He said she was his student. Said she was unstable. Had papers to prove it. I didn't touch his papers. I looked at her. Saw the fear in her eyes. And asked one question. Do you trust him? She whispered. No. And in that moment, everything about him changed. See, men like him hide behind money. Behind power. Behind reputation. But he made one mistake. He brought that lie into my city. My name is Shin Young-ha. And in my world, the truth doesn't stay buried. The silence in the Eclipse Lounge was absolute, a heavy, pressurized thing that seemed to vibrate against the floor-to-ceiling glass. At the center of it all, Nanyanjo Uriella remained collapsed on the marble, her wet plaid blanket splayed around her like a broken wing. The man in the charcoal suit, the philanthropist, took a step forward, his polished shoes clicking with an arrogance that filled the room. He didn't look at the armed guards or the shadow-drenched corners of the club. He only looked at Uriella, his smile remaining perfectly, terrifyingly fixed. Come now, Uriella, he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. You've caused enough of a scene. Mr. Shin is a very busy man, and your instability is no reason to disrupt his evening. We have your medication in the car. He reached out a hand, his fingers manicured and steady, expecting her to take it as she always had. But Shin Young-ha didn't move aside. He remained a statue of dark silk and cold intent, his shadow stretching long across the floor until it swallowed the philanthropist's reach. Young-ha didn't look at the man. He didn't look at the leather folder full of legal lies that now sat abandoned on the mahogany table. He slowly knelt, the fabric of his black suit trousers crisp even in the grit of the rainwater she had brought in. He was close enough to see the frantic pulse in her neck, the way her deep brown skin was pebbled with cold, and the precise jaggedness of the cut above her brow. Ignore him, Young-ha said. His voice was a low, resonant hum, devoid of the philanthropist's artificial warmth. It was the voice of a man who dealt in the weight of souls, not the convenience of words. The philanthropist's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. Mr. Shin, I really must insist. As her legal guardian, I am responsible for her safety. She is. I didn't ask you. Young-ha interrupted, his gaze never leaving Uriella's face. He reached out, not to grab her, but to gently move a wet coil of hair away from her eyes. His touch was surprising, cool, steady, and utterly devoid of the ownership Uriella had grown to loathe. Uriella looked up. Her large, emotional eyes were swimming with a terror so profound it seemed to pull at the very air in the room. She saw the sharp jawline of the man before her, the intense, narrow eyes that seemed to read the secrets written in her scars. Behind Young-ha stood a world of violence she didn't understand, but in front of her was the man who had turned her life into a curated cage. Young-ha leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear over the violent drumming of the monsoon against the glass. Look at me, he commanded softly. Uriella's gaze locked onto his. In that moment, the rest of the world, the guards, the sub-bosses, the man in the charcoal suit, simply ceased to exist. There was only the predator kneeling in front of her and the predator standing behind her. He says he's here to save you, Young-ha said, his eyes searching hers with a terrifyingly lucid focus. He says these papers prove you belong in his care. He says you're sick. He paused, his thumb hovering near the bruise on her jaw. But I don't care what he says. I care what you say. The philanthropist took another step, his face reddening. This is highly irregular, Shin. I have connections in the ministry. I have. You have 10 seconds to be silent before my men find out if your blood is as expensive as your suit, Young-ha said, not even turning his head. The threat was so casual, it was more frightening than a shout. The room went back to ice. Young-ha turned his full attention back to Uriella. One question, Uriella. Just one. And whatever you say, that is how this night ends. He took a breath, the scent of expensive cologne and ozone from the storm mingling between them. Do you trust him? The philanthropist opened his mouth to speak, but the click of a safety being disengaged by a guard near the elevator cut him off. Ariella felt the weight of the word in her throat. For 2 years, she had been told she was nothing without the foundation. She had been told her voice didn't matter, that her memory was faulty, that her fear was a symptom of a disease they had invented for her. To say it was to declare war. To say it was to burn the only bridge she had ever known. She looked at the philanthropist. For the first time, she didn't see a savior. She saw the jagged edges of the cage. Then she looked back at Young-ha. He wasn't offering her a hug or a platitude. He was offering her a choice. Her lips trembled. A single tear escaped, carving a clean path through the grime on her cheek. "No," she whispered. The word was small, barely a breath, but in the silence of the Eclipse lounge, it sounded like a landslide. Young-ha nodded slowly. The no didn't just reject the man in the suit. It ignited something behind Young-ha's eyes, a dark, ancestral fire. He stood up in one fluid motion, turning finally to face the philanthropist. The transition was instantaneous. The man who had been almost tender with the girl on the floor was gone, replaced by the apex predator of the soul underworld. "You heard her," Young-ha said, his voice now carrying to every corner of the room. "She's confused, Shin. You can't take the word of a." Young-ha crossed the distance between them before the man could finish the sentence. He didn't strike him. He simply leaned into the philanthropist's personal space. His presence, so overwhelming the other man, actually recoiled. "She isn't confused," Young-ha said, his voice like grinding stones. "She's honest. And I find that your presence has made my floor dirty." He glanced at the leather folder on the table. "Take your papers. They have no value here. In this city, I am the only law that matters, and I've just decided that Ariella is under my protection." "You're making a mistake," the philanthropist hissed, his polished mask finally dropping to reveal a sneering, ugly desperation. "You don't know who you're crossing." Young-ha smiled then, a thin, lethal line. "I know exactly who I'm crossing. A man who brings lies into my house and expects me to help him tell them." He turned to his head of security. "Show this philanthropist to the door. If he's seen within 3 blocks of this club again, remove his tongue. He clearly hasn't been using it to tell the truth." As the guards moved in, seizing the man in the charcoal suit by the arms, Ariella remained on the floor, shaking. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only a cold, hollow exhaustion. She watched as the man who had owned her life was dragged toward the elevator, his protests dying out as the brass doors hissed shut. Young-ha remained standing where he was for a long moment, looking out at the rain-lashed city. The trajectory of his life had been a straight line of cold calculations and power moves. But as he turned back to look at the girl in the plaid blanket, a girl who had nothing to offer him but a truth that would cost him a fortune in political capital, he knew that line had just been shattered. He walked back to her and held out his hand, not like the other man had. This time, he waited for her to reach back. "Come," he said. "The rain is over for you." The elevator doors hissed shut, cutting off the philanthropist's final, desperate threats, but his presence lingered in the lounge like a foul scent. The high-end filtration system of the Eclipse lounge hummed, working to scrub the air of the outside storm and the sudden, violent tension that had just peaked. Young-ha remained standing, his back to the room, watching the rain-lashed neon of Seoul through the glass. Behind him, he heard the soft, ragged breathing of Nanyanjo Ariella. She was still on the floor, her fingers white-knuckled as she gripped the wet plaid blanket. She looked like a small, dark island in the middle of his vast, marble sea. "Min-ho," Young-ha said without turning. His second in command, a man whose silence was as lethal as his aim, stepped out of the shadows. "Sir, clear the floor. Close the lounge. No more business tonight." Within seconds, the remaining sub-bosses and staff vanished. They knew the look in Young-ha's eyes. It was the look of a man who was no longer calculating profit margins, but weighing a life. Just as the last guard exited, the internal comms on the mahogany table chirped. It was the lobby security. Young-ha pressed the button with a slow, deliberate finger. "Speak." "Sir, Mr. Park, the man who just left," He's refusing to get into his car. He's demanding a private word. He says he has a commercial reconciliation to offer. Young Ha's jaw tightened. Commercial reconciliation. It was a polite term for a bribe. It was the language of men who believed everything and everyone had a price tag. Bring him back up, Young Ha said, his voice dropping an octave. Just him. No security. No briefcase. Ariella flinched at the words. She looked up at Young Ha, her large, emotional eyes wide with a new kind of terror. She thought the deal was being made. She thought she was the currency. Stay where you are, Young Ha told her. It wasn't a request, it was an anchor. 2 minutes later, the elevator opened again. Mr. Park stepped out. The charcoal suit was slightly wrinkled now, and the philanthropic mask had been replaced by a sharp, calculating hunger. He walked toward Young Ha, ignoring Ariella as if she were a piece of discarded furniture. I apologize for the theatrics earlier, Shin, Park said, smoothing his hair. But let's be professionals. You're a businessman. You deal in logistics, territory, and influence. This girl? She's a logistical error. One that is very important to my foundations, overseas investors. Young Ha leaned against the edge of the mahogany table, his posture relaxed, though his eyes remained fixed on Park. Go on. I know the Eclipse Lounge needs a new liquor distribution license. I know you've been having trouble with the port authorities in Incheon, Park said, leaning in, his voice becoming a conspiratorial whisper. I can make those problems vanish by tomorrow morning. I'll also deposit $3 million into your offshore account in Singapore. All I want is the girl and a non-disclosure agreement. Park looked over his shoulder at Ariella, a sneer curling his lip. She's a nobody, Shin. A foreign runaway with a fabricated history. Why risk your empire for a girl who doesn't even have a valid visa? Young Ha looked down at his hands, then back at Park. 3 million. And the Incheon ports. And the license, Park added, sensing victory. Consider it a gift between equals. Young Ha pushed himself off the table and walked slowly toward Park. He stopped so close that Park had to tilt his head back. Young Ha reached out and adjusted the lapel of Park's charcoal suit, his movements precise and terrifyingly calm. You think we're equals? Young Ha asked softly. We both run cities, Shin. We both manage people. No, Young Ha whispered. I run a syndicate. I deal in blood, debt, and loyalty. You deal in children. You hide behind a foundation and scholarship papers to hunt the vulnerable. Young Ha's hand moved from the lapel to the back of Park's neck, his grip tightening with a sudden, bone-crushing intensity. Park's face went pale. You didn't come here to negotiate, Young Ha hissed. You came here because you're a predator who's lost his scent. You looked at Ariella and saw an error. I looked at her and saw a mirror. Young Ha leaned into Park's ear. I know how men like you work. You don't want her back because you care about your investors. You want her back because she's the only one brave enough to say no to you. And you can't have a no living in my city. It ruins your reputation. Young Ha shoved him back. Park stumbled, his polished shoes sliding on the wet marble where Ariella had collapsed. The bribe is an insult, Young Ha said, his voice now booming through the empty lounge. Not because the amount is too small, but because you think I'm as cheap as you are. I don't need your help with the ports. I don't need your license. And I certainly don't need your money. You're making an enemy you can't afford, Shin. Park screamed, his voice cracking. Young Ha turned to Minho, who was waiting by the door. He's still talking. I don't like it when the trash makes noise. Minho moved with the speed of a strike team. He didn't use a weapon. He grabbed Park by the collar and the belt, lifting the grown man off his feet. Park's legs kicked uselessly in the air, his expensive charcoal suit bunching up. Wait, Park yelled. I can give you more. 5 million. Young Ha didn't even look back. He walked toward Ariella and knelt beside her again. Take him out the back, Young Ha commanded. Through the alley, he chased her down. Let the rain wash him into the gutter where he belongs. If he ever tries to negotiate with me again, don't bring him to the lounge. Bring him to the basement. Minho nodded and marched the struggling, screaming philanthropist toward the service elevator. The doors closed on Park's cries, leaving the lounge in a sudden, ringing silence once more. Ariella was shaking harder now, the plaid blanket slipping from her shoulders. She looked at Young Ha, her eyes searching his face for the trick, for the hidden cost. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the receding storm. "Why would you throw all that away for me?" Young Ha looked at the empty spot where Park had stood, then back at the girl. He saw the cut on her brow, the wet hair, and the fierce, flickering light of a survivor in her eyes. "Because," Young Ha said, his voice surprisingly gentle as he held out his hand. "He forgot one thing. This is my city, and I don't allow predators to hunt in my backyard." He waited. This time, Ariella didn't hesitate. She reached out and placed her hand in his. Her skin was freezing, but as his fingers closed around hers, the warmth of the lion's den finally began to seep in. "Minho will take you to my private residence," he said, helping her to her feet. "You'll have a doctor, a warm bed, and a door that locks from the inside. Tomorrow, we start the war. But tonight you sleep." As he led her toward the elevator, the neon lights of Seoul flickered against the glass, casting their shadows long across the floor. A girl who had found her voice, and a boss who had found his purpose. The private estate of Shin Young-ha sat like a fortress of glass and charcoal stone atop the hills of Songbuk-dong, overlooking the glittering, rain-slicked sprawl of Seoul. Inside, the air was filtered, climate-controlled, and heavy with the scent of sandalwood and old money. In the master guest suite, the only sound was the rhythmic, shallow breathing of Nanyonjo Ariella. Young-ha stood in the threshold of the darkened room, his silhouette a sharp, black blade against the dim hallway light. He had traded his suit jacket for a silk waistcoat, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the heavy ink of a dragon that coiled around his forearm, a mark of the life he had chosen to survive the one he had been born into. He watched her. She was tucked under a duvet of Egyptian cotton that cost more than the Foundation's scholarship probably paid out in a year. Her deep brown skin was stark against the white linens, and even in sleep, her brow was furrowed, her hands clutching the edge of the blanket as if she expected it to be ripped away at any moment. He looked at the small, butterfly bandage over her eye. The doctor had come and gone, leaving behind a report of malnutrition, old bruising, and the kind of systemic stress that aged a heart before its time. Seeing her like this, quiet, broken, yet safe, sent a cold shiver through Young-ha that had nothing to do with the storm outside. It triggered a door in his mind he had kept dead-bolted for 20 years. Suddenly, the scent of the sandalwood was gone, replaced by the cloying, metallic smell of a cheap Seoul basement and the scent of lilies. He was 10 years old again. He remembered the way his mother had looked, just as radiant as Ariella, with eyes that still believed in the goodness of men. He remembered the man who had visited their small, cramped apartment. A man in a charcoal suit. A man with a respectable title, a high-ranking official in the district office who spoke of better opportunities and educational grants for a bright boy like Young-ha. His mother had smiled that day. It was the last time he remembered her truly smiling. She had trusted the papers. She had trusted the soft-spoken promises of a man who didn't look like a monster. Young-ha's jaw tightened as the memory shifted to the night the mask slipped. He remembered the sound of his mother's muffled pleas through a thin door, the way the respectable man's voice had turned into something jagged and cruel when he realized he wasn't being watched. He remembered the day his mother was discarded, not by a criminal, but by the system that had promised to protect her. The official had used his connections to brand her a liar, a thief, and an unstable woman. He had used the law to erase her existence so he could keep his reputation clean. Young-ha had watched his mother wither away in a cage of legal documents and public shame, her spirit broken by a predator who wore a tie instead of a gun. That was the night Young-ha realized that the most dangerous men in the world weren't the ones in the alleys. They were the ones in the high-rises who could turn a person into a ghost with a single signature. A soft whimper from the bed snapped him back to the present. Ariella shifted, her head turning restlessly on the pillow. "No," she murmured, a faint, fractured sound. "Please, the papers." Young-ha stepped into the room, his footsteps silent on the deep pile rug. He sat in the armchair beside the bed, his presence a dark, protective weight in the room. He didn't reach out to touch her. He knew that even a kind hand could feel like a shackle to someone who had been owned, but he stayed. He looked at his hands. They were stained with the blood of the underworld, but they had never touched the innocent. He had spent his entire life building an empire of shadows specifically so he would never have to bow to the respectable men who had destroyed his mother. He had become the monster to hunt the men who pretended they weren't. Mr. Park, the philanthropist, had made a fatal mistake. He hadn't just brought a lie into Youngha's city, he had brought back a ghost. He had walked into the Eclipse Lounge wearing the face of the man who had murdered Youngha's childhood. "You aren't a ghost, Uriella," Youngha whispered into the darkness, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "And you aren't an error." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy silver coin, the marker of his position. He flipped it idly, the metal catching the faint moonlight through the curtains. Tomorrow, the city would wake up to a war. He would use every contact, every debt, and every shadow he owned to find the girls Park had sponsored. He would find the donors, the judges, and the psychiatrists who had signed those papers. He would burn the foundation to the ground and sow the earth with salt. It wasn't just about Uriella anymore. It was about the boy in the basement who had been too small to fight back. Uriella's breathing eventually evened out, her grip on the blanket loosening as the safety of the house finally took hold. Youngha didn't leave. He stayed in the chair, a silent sentinel in a silk waistcoat, watching the girls sleep. The rain continued to lash against the windows of the estate, but inside the lion's den, the storm had finally met its match. Youngha closed his eyes for a brief second, the image of his mother's broken smile finally fading, replaced by the memory of Uriella's single, whispered no. The truth was coming, and it was going to be the most expensive thing Mr. Park had ever encountered. The morning light in the Songbuk-dong estate was thin and gray, filtered through the lingering mist of the monsoon. Inside the breakfast nook, the atmosphere was heavy with a different kind of silence, one that wasn't born of fear, but of the raw, uncomfortable weight of the truth finally being told. Uriella sat wrapped in a thick, dark robe Youngha's staff had provided. Her hands were cupped around a mug of tea, the steam rising to meet the hollow fatigue in her eyes. Youngha sat across from her, his expression unreadable, a tablet displaying encrypted files sitting dark on the table between them. He didn't push her. He simply waited, his presence a steady, grounding force in the high-ceilinged room. "They didn't just take my passport," Uriella began, her voice brittle, cracking like dry parchment. "They took the person I was supposed to be." She explained the Global Scholars Initiative. It had started in her home village, glossy brochures promising a full ride to Seoul National University, a dormitory in the heart of the city, and a stipend that would have supported her entire family for a decade. Mr. Park had arrived like a savior, shaking hands with the elders, posing for photos with the girls who had the highest marks. "The moment we landed at Incheon, the guardians were waiting," she said, her grip tightening on the mug until her knuckles turned ash gray. "They told us there was a clerical error with our visas. They said the government needed to hold our passports for verification. Then they took us to a building in Gyeonggi, not a dormitory, a warehouse with partitioned rooms and no windows." Youngha's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his eyes locked on hers. "The scholarship was a lie," she continued, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "There were no classes, only donors. Men who paid tuition directly to Mr. Park in exchange for dinner dates. Then weekend trips. They used the psychiatric papers to keep us compliant. If we cried, if we fought back, they called the police and showed them the documents. They told the authorities we were illegal, mentally unstable, and prone to hallucinations. Who would the police believe? A billionaire philanthropist or a girl who wasn't even supposed to be in the country?" Uriella looked down at the table, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He told me if I ever ran, he would send the medical reports back to my mother. He said he would tell her I was a disgraced runaway, that I'd wasted the family's honor on drugs and men. I stayed for a year because I couldn't let her believe that lie." Youngha finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. The donors. I need names. I don't have names, Ariella said, looking up with a flash of desperate regret. They used aliases. But I saw the envelopes. Blue silk-lined envelopes with a gold crest. A phoenix rising from a shield. They arrived every Friday. Youngha's eyes sharpened. He knew that crest. It belonged to the Syrian Club, an ultra-exclusive circle of the city's political and judicial elite. It wasn't just a trafficking ring, it was a blackmail machine. Park wasn't just selling the girls. He was buying leverage over the most powerful men in the country. You said there were others, Youngha said. How many? 14 when I arrived, Ariella replied. 6 when I left. The others, they graduated. That's what Mr. Park called it when they stopped being useful and were sent to the outreach centers in the countryside. Nobody ever hears from them again. Youngha stood up, the chair scraping sharply against the stone floor. The cold fury he had been suppressing since the night before finally had a target. This wasn't just a rogue predator. It was a factory of human misery protected by the very people who wrote the laws. He picked up his phone and sent a single, encrypted message to a contact he kept in the deepest shadows of the prosecutor's office. The scholarship is a harvest. I have the witness. Get the digital sweep ready. We're going after the Phoenix. He turned back to Ariella. She looked smaller now that the secret was out, but the terror in her eyes had been replaced by a flickering, defiant hope. You did well, Ariella, he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. You gave me the map. Now, I'm going to burn the territory. What happens to me now? She asked, her voice trembling. Youngha walked over to the window, looking out at the city he ruled, a city that was about to find out exactly what happened when someone brought a lie into his home. Now, he said, his reflection in the glass looking like a shadow cast over the entire skyline. You watch them fall. And then, we get your passport back. The real one. The air in the dimly lit basement of a nondescript tea house in Zhangyo was thick with the scent of damp earth and fermented leaves. Shin Youngha sat across from a man who looked like a ghost of the legal system. Prosecutor Kong. A man whose career had been buried under a mountain of procedural errors the moment he started looking into the Syrian Club. Youngha pushed a burner phone across the scarred wooden table. I have the survivor, he said, his voice cutting through the low hum of the tea house's ventilation. And she has the gold crest. The Phoenix. Kang's hand, weathered and stained with nicotine, trembled slightly as he reached for the phone. He didn't look up. You know what you're asking, Shin. The people behind that crest don't just buy judges. They own the ink the laws are printed with. If we miss, there won't be enough of us left to bury. I'm not asking for a trial, Kong. I'm asking for a tactical erasure, Youngha replied, his eyes cold and fixed. You provide the digital backdoors to the Ministry of Justice's server. I provide the physical persuasion to make the donors talk. We don't just arrest them. We make it so they never existed. Kong finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot but burning with a dormant, desperate hunger for justice. And the girl? Ariella? The moment we trigger this, she becomes the most hunted person in Korea. She's in the lion's den, Youngha said, a shadow of a grim smile appearing on his face. And I've already reinforced the walls. As the two men leaned over a map of the city, marking the locations of the outreach centers Ariella had described, the alliance was sealed, not with a handshake, but with a shared understanding of the blood that was about to be spilled. The underworld and the remnants of the law had found a common enemy, and for the first time in 20 years, the Phoenix was no longer flying unseen. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the city in a deceptive, sparkling calm. But in the shadows of Zhangyo, the first gears of the retribution machine began to turn. The peace of the Songbuk-dong estate was not broken by a shout, but by the sudden, synchronized death of the perimeter cameras. Youngha was in the study, a glass of untouched whiskey on the desk, when the monitors flickered into static. He didn't reach for a panic button. He simply stood, the movement as fluid and silent as a shadow, and pulled a customized semi-automatic from the hidden magnetic holster beneath the mahogany. He knew how Park worked now. A man who bought judges didn't call the police when his property went missing. He called the cleaners. Minho, Young Ha said into his earpiece, his voice a low, lethal silk. They're on the north wall, sir. 6 of them. Professional kit. Non-attributable. Don't let them reach the guest suite, Young Ha commanded. I want them to understand whose house they've broken into before they die. In the guest suite, Ariella was jolted from a light sleep by the heavy, muffled thud of a flashbang detonating in the hallway. The sound was followed by the sharp, rhythmic spat of suppressed gunfire. She scrambled to the corner of the bed, the Egyptian cotton sheets tangling around her legs like a trap. The door, the one Young Ha promised locked from the inside, groaned under the weight of a professional breach. A man in a tactical mask and gray fatigues burst through, his weapon raised, the red laser of his sight dancing across the wall until it settled on Ariella's chest. He didn't look like a kidnapper. He looked like a soldier. Target secured. The man grunted into his radio, stepping toward her. Moving to. He never finished the sentence. A single shot hissed through the open doorway, catching the mercenary in the side of the neck. He collapsed without a sound, his blood blooming across the white rug in a violent, spreading Rorschach blot. Young Ha stepped into the room. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was still in his waistcoat and dress shirt, his sleeves rolled up, the dragon tattoo on his arm appearing to writhe in the flickering emergency lights. He didn't look at the body on the floor. He looked at Ariella. I told you, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm amidst the chaos. In this city, I am the only law. Another shadow appeared in the hallway, a second mercenary raising a shotgun. Young Ha didn't flinch. He pivoted, firing 2 rounds into the man's center mass before the intruder could level his weapon. The thunder of the unsuppressed shots echoed through the high ceilings of the estate, a declaration of war that could be heard for miles. Downstairs, the sound of the struggle was fading into the wet slap of boots on stone and a quiet, efficient cleanup of Young Ha's personal guard. Minho appeared at the door, his face streaked with a thin line of red that wasn't his. The perimeter is clear, sir. 2 escaped in a black SUV. We're tracking the plates. Young Ha nodded, then turned his full attention to Ariella. She was shaking, her breath coming in ragged, terrified gasps, her eyes fixed on the man bleeding out at the foot of her bed. They won't come back tonight, Young Ha said, stepping closer. He reached out, and for the first time, he let his hand rest on her shoulder. His grip wasn't a shackle, it was an anchor. Park just realized that legal papers aren't the only thing that can make a man disappear. Ariella looked up at him, her face pale. He'll never stop. As long as I'm alive, I'm a witness he can't afford. Then we'll make sure he can't afford anything else, Young Ha replied. He looked down at the dead mercenary, his eyes cold and ancient. Minho, take the bodies. Leave them on the steps of the Global Scholars Foundation. No note, just the gold crests from their gear. He looked back at Ariella, his thumb brushing against the fabric of her robe. He wanted to turn you into a ghost. Tonight, I'm going to show him what a real ghost looks like. As the rain began to fall again, washing the blood from the stone steps of the estate, the transition was complete. Ariella was no longer just a victim, and Young Ha was no longer just a boss. They were a weapon. The air in the estate's private library was thick with the hum of high-end servers and the smell of ozone. Young Ha had brought in his architects, 2 elite digital specialists who existed in the white space between corporate security and state-level espionage. They sat hunched over glowing monitors, their faces illuminated by the rapid scroll of green and white code. Ariella stood between them, her presence a stark contrast to the cold technology. She was still wearing the dark silk robe, but her posture had changed. The slumped shoulders of the victim were beginning to square into the resolve of a witness. The physical files are ghosts, one of the architects muttered, his fingers dancing across a mechanical keyboard. Park is smart. He's using a decentralized ledger. Every donation is scrubbed through 3 different shell companies before it even hits a bank. We can see the money moving, but we can't see who's sending it. Young Ha stood by the window, his reflection a dark silhouette against the glass. He's not just moving money. He's moving lives. There has to be a master manifest. A list of the scholars and their donors. It's not on the main server. The other architect replied, shaking his head. It's air-gapped. If we try to brute force it, the whole system self-destructs. Ariella stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the screen. He didn't use a computer for the master list. Not a normal one. Young-ha turned to her, his interest piqued. What do you mean? Every Friday, before the donors arrived, he went into the sub-basement of the foundation office, Ariella explained, her voice steadying. He carried a small, silver tablet. It wasn't connected to the network. He called it the Ledger of the Living. He told us that as long as our names were on that screen, we were protected. If they disappeared, we disappeared. A localized, encrypted tablet, Young-ha mused, his mind already spinning through the logistics of a breach. But he must sink it eventually. A man like Park wouldn't risk losing that much leverage to a hardware failure. He did, Ariella said. But he didn't sink it to a cloud. He synced it to the Foundation's internal security feed. He used the medical reports as the encryption key. He told me once that our trauma was the only thing that kept the system locked. The architects exchanged a look of grim realization. He's using biometric encryption tied to the girl's psychiatric files, the first one whispered. It's a dead man's switch in reverse. The files stay encrypted as long as the patient is marked as active in the system. Can you find the sync point? Young-ha asked. If Ariella can give us the specific file ID for her own medical report, we can use it as a digital skeleton key to trace the uplink, the architect said, his eyes lighting up. But we need the exact string of numbers from her intake form. Ariella closed her eyes, the memory of that first, terrifying day in the warehouse flooding back. She remembered the cold room, the flash of the camera, and the man in the white coat who had stamped a red number onto the corner of her folder. SE-0419-AF, she whispered. That was my designation. He made me memorize it. He said it was my new name. The architect's fingers blurred across their keys. Seconds felt like hours as the screen cycled through layers of firewalls. Suddenly, a single, golden progress bar appeared. We're in, the lead architect breathed. It's not just a list. It's a map. Every girl, every donor, every bank account. There are judges here, Shin, members of the National Assembly, even a director from the Blue House. Young-ha walked over to the monitor, his eyes scanning the names of the respectable men who had bought and sold futures. The list was a roll call of the city's elite, the same men who preached law and order by day. Print it, Young-ha commanded, his voice a low, lethal rasp. And the bank records. I want every cent of that tuition traced back to the source. What are you going to do? Ariella asked, watching the printer begin its rhythmic, mechanical hum. Young-ha looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes softened into something like pride. I'm going to make their money worthless. And then, I'm going to show them that in my city, the ledger of the living has a very different meaning. He picked up the first page of the printout, a list of 3 prominent judges. He folded it neatly and tucked it into his waistcoat. Park thought he was building a cage, Young-ha said, turning toward the door. He didn't realize he was just building a funeral pyre. And he just gave me the match. The following morning, the Syrian club did not wake up to a police raid. They woke up to a ghost in their machines. Young-ha stood in the command center of his estate, watching as the architects executed the first phase of the strike. He didn't want a messy public trial that could be bought or buried. He wanted a total systemic collapse. He had spent the last 6 hours coordinating with Prosecutor Kong, ensuring that every digital arrow was aimed at a vital organ. Initiate the Phoenix Protocol, Young-ha commanded. With a single keystroke, the encrypted manifest of the Syrian club was released, not to the police, but to the personal accounts of every spouse, board member, and political rival of the men on that list. Simultaneously, the bank records Ariella had helped uncover were sent to the International Tax Oversight. By the time the sun was fully above the Seoul skyline, the respectable men who had bought and sold futures were finding their private lives in flames and their assets frozen. But Young-ha wasn't finished. While the digital world crumbled, he took to the streets. He arrived at the Global Scholars Foundation headquarters in a fleet of black sedans that blocked the entire intersection. There were no sirens, only the heavy, synchronized thud of car doors closing. Young-ha stepped out, his black suit sharp against the morning mist, his eyes fixed on the glass-and-steel tower that had served as a warehouse for human misery. "Minho, take the lower levels. I want every girl in that building out and into the safe houses before the police arrive to investigate," Young-ha said. He walked through the lobby, his presence so overwhelming that the security guards, men who had been paid to look the other way, simply stepped aside. He took the private elevator to the penthouse. When the doors opened, he found Mr. Park standing by the window, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, watching the news reports of his foundation's unprecedented data breach. Park didn't turn around. "You've destroyed me, Shin. You've destroyed them all. Do you have any idea the vacuum this creates? The chaos." "I don't deal in vacuums, Park. I deal in debts," Young-ha said, walking to the center of the room. "And yours just came due." Park turned, his face haggard, the polished philanthropist finally erased. "They'll kill her, you know. Even if I'm gone, the men on that list, they can't let Ariella live. She's the heart of the evidence." "They won't," Young-ha replied, his voice a low, lethal hum. "Because while you were watching the news, my men were visiting their homes. I didn't send them with warrants. I sent them with the blue silk envelopes. I told them that if anything happens to Ariella, even a broken fingernail, the rest of the ledger goes to the public square. Not the scrubbed version. The raw footage from your sub-basement." Park's glass shattered on the floor. He realized then that Young-ha hadn't just exposed the club, he had taken ownership of it. He had replaced Park as the keeper of the secrets, but with one crucial difference. Young-ha didn't want the money. "You're a monster," Park whispered. "I'm the monster you brought into your house," Young-ha said. He leaned in, his shadow swallowing the older man. "Now, you're going to call the prosecutor. You're going to confess to every medical report, every scholarship, and every cent you stole. And if you miss a single name, I'll let the donors find you in your cell." As the sirens finally began to wail in the distance, the sound of a system finally forced to do its job, Young-ha walked out of the office. He didn't look back at the ruin he had created. Back at the estate, Ariella stood on the balcony, watching the smoke rise from a distant part of the city where the Foundation's servers were being physically dismantled. She felt the weight of the last 2 years finally beginning to lift, replaced by a strange, soaring lightness. Young-ha joined her, his silhouette joining hers against the gray sky. He didn't say anything at first. He simply pulled a small, dark blue booklet from his pocket and held it out to her. It was her passport, the real one. No stamps from outreach centers, no psychiatric markers. Just her name. "It's over, Ariella," he said. "Is it?" she asked, her voice steady for the first time. "What happens to the girls?" "They're safe. They have their names back. And they have the Foundation's endowment to start over. I've made sure the funds were redirected." Ariella looked at the passport, then at the man beside her. He was still the boss of the underworld, still a man of shadows and violence. But in his city, for the first time, the truth hadn't stayed buried. The morning of the final departure was quiet, the air crisp and smelling of the salt that lingered after the monsoon's retreat. In the driveway of the Songbuk-dong estate, a black sedan sat idling, its exhaust a soft white plume in the early light. Young-ha stood on the stone steps, his hands in his pockets, his coat open to the cool breeze. He looked less like a syndicate boss and more like a man who had finally stepped out of a long shadow. He watched as Ariella walked toward him, dressed in a simple, high-quality trench coat and carrying a single leather bag. She didn't look like the girl who had crashed through his club doors in a wet plaid blanket. Her oval face was calm, her large eyes clear, and the cut above her eyebrow had faded to a thin, silver memory. She stopped in front of him, the space between them filled with the weight of everything they had dismantled together. "The enrollment is confirmed," Young-ha said, his voice low and steady. "A university in London. They have a prestigious program in international law. Your tuition, your housing, it's all been handled through a blind trust. No gold crests, no blue envelopes. Just your name. Ariella looked at the house, then back at him. I didn't think I'd ever see a classroom again. I thought my life ended in that warehouse. Your life didn't end, Young-ha replied, a ghost of a smile touching his sharp jawline. It was just interrupted. He reached into his pocket and handed her a small, velvet pouch. Inside was a simple gold necklace with a small, unadorned pendant. If you ever find yourself in a room where the doors don't lock from the inside, or if you meet another man who smiles too calmly, you call the number engraved on the back. My people are everywhere, Ariella. You are under the protection of the lion, no matter where you fly. Ariella took the necklace, her fingers brushing against his. The coldness that had defined Young-ha for 20 years didn't flinch. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to pull away from the light. Why London? She asked softly. You could have kept me here. You could have made me a part of your world. My world is built on debts and shadows, Young-ha said, looking out over the city of Seoul, which was finally waking up to the news of the Surian club's total dissolution. You've spent enough time in the dark. You belong where the sun stays up. Ariella stepped forward and did something she hadn't dared to do before. She hugged him. It was a brief, fierce acknowledgement of the man who had traded an empire's worth of peace to give her back her soul. Young-ha stood still, his hand hovering for a second before resting gently on her back, a final, silent promise of sanctuary. She pulled away, wiped a stray tear from her cheek, and climbed into the back of the sedan. As the car began to roll down the winding drive toward the airport, she looked back through the rear window. Young-ha remained on the steps, a solitary, powerful figure against the backdrop of the fortress he had turned into a home. He watched until the taillights disappeared around the bend. Then, he turned and walked back inside. The estate was silent, but it no longer felt empty. The memories of the basement, of his mother's broken smile, and of the boy who couldn't fight back were still there, but they were no longer a haunting. They were a foundation. He walked into his study and sat at the mahogany desk. There was a new file waiting for him, a list of outreach centers in the northern provinces that were still operating under charitable banners. Young-ha picked up his fountain pen, his eyes narrowing with a familiar, lethal focus. The war with the Phoenix was over, but the city was still full of predators who thought they could hunt in his backyard. He began to write. The truth was no longer buried, and Shin Young-ha was just getting started.